Derrick Mason and Leon Price, two names that once echoed through the streets of Birmingham like a warning. One ruled with strategy, the other with fear. Their war wasn't just about money or power. It was about dominance, revenge, and the brutal transformation of a city from razor gangs to modern-day drive-bys. What began as a rivalry between two men soon became one of the bloodiest gang feuds in UK history. A story written in silence, loyalty, and gunfire. In the late 1980s, Birmingham's streets carried an unease that never truly slept. The factories that once roared with life had fallen silent, leaving behind restless young men and empty pockets. Out of this silence grew something far more dangerous, ambition mixed with anger. Among the chaos, two names began to shape the future of the city's underworld. On one side was the Johnson crew, a group that moved with quiet intelligence. Their leader, Derrick Mason, wasn't loud or flashy. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and own it without saying a word. His calmness hid the sharp mind of someone who understood power was best used like a blade, quiet, clean, and final. Across town, in the narrow back streets of Handsworth, the Burger Bar Boys began to rise. Their leader, Leon Price, was Mason's opposite, loud, impulsive, and ruthless. He wanted to be feared, not respected. He saw fear as the quickest route to control. While Mason built connections and invested in legitimate businesses, Leon built soldiers. He handed out guns the way others handed out cigarettes, promising money, cars, and women to anyone loyal enough to pull the trigger for him. At first, their worlds didn't collide. The Johnson crew ran their operations like businessmen, moving drugs quietly through clubs and warehouses, bribing small-time officials and laundering their profits through local businesses. They looked polished on the surface, hosting charity events and buying respect in their community. The Burger Bar Boys were raw and violent, their influence spreading through intimidation and street-level dominance. They ruled their blocks through fear, painting messages on walls and sending warnings through gunfire. The tension began when territories started to overlap. Mason's men began selling in areas Leon considered his. It started with minor threats, then cars vandalized, and eventually gunfire in the distance. The older generation of Birmingham's criminals, the ones who remembered the razor gangs of the 1960s, watched with disbelief. Back then, fights were personal. Now, they were public. The young men of this new era weren't bound by old codes. They didn't talk before they acted. Every night, the city seemed to hold its breath. Rumors spread fast. Who got shot, who went missing, who switched sides. The police could feel something was coming, but didn't know when. Behind closed doors, Derrick Mason watched his organization grow, but sensed the danger of Leon's rise. He knew that fear could spread faster than respect, and that scared him more than any bullet. Leon, on the other hand, saw Mason's silence as weakness. By the end of that year, the streets had chosen sides. Young men who once played football together now carried weapons for rival crews. Graffiti marked the borders, and loyalty was tested every night. Birmingham wasn't just a city anymore. It was a chessboard, and every move left a trail of blood. The old rules were gone, and a new kind of war had just begun. By the early 1990s, Birmingham's underworld had matured into something darkly organized, a city beneath the city where every pub, nightclub, and corner shop had invisible strings attached to someone powerful. The Johnson crew thrived under Derrick Mason's leadership, moving like shadows. They weren't just thugs, they were investors. Mason had built a system that blended crime with commerce, using clean money to hide dirty profits. His men dressed sharply, spoke softly, and operated under a strict code. Violence was never the first move, only the last. They opened car washes, managed local clubs, and even sponsored community events, gaining a strange sort of respect from people who feared them. To outsiders, they looked like businessmen. To insiders, They were the architects of a growing empire. The Burger Bar Boys, however, were louder and faster. Leon Price didn't care for appearances. His crew dealt openly, showing off their wealth with gold chains, sports cars, and thick wads of cash. They wanted everyone to know who ruled the streets. Their operations spread like wildfire, fueled by intimidation. Leon's philosophy was simple. If someone questioned your power, remind them with violence. He recruited aggressively, pulling in young boys who had grown up seeing only struggle. These recruits were loyal because Leon offered them what the city hadn't: identity, purpose, and protection. To them, being a Burger Bar Boy was more than crime. It was family. The city began to divide. The Johnson crew controlled parts of Aston and Small Heath, while the Burger Bar Boys dominated Handsworth and Ladywood. Boundaries blurred as both sides expanded, chasing money and territory. Every illegal deal became a statement. Every night carried the threat of something exploding. The tension wasn't always visible, but it was felt like static in the air before a storm. Police reports noted rising gun incidents and unexplained disappearances, but witnesses stayed silent. Fear had gripped the neighborhoods tighter than any law could. Meanwhile, Mason noticed the growing recklessness of Leon's operation. He understood that chaos draws attention, and attention brings police. Mason preferred balance, but Leon's hunger for dominance was uncontrollable. The Burger Bar Boys began encroaching into Johnson crew areas, snatching deals, threatening suppliers, and spreading rumors that Mason had grown weak. Each small act of provocation built toward something larger, something unavoidable. In the background, Birmingham's media started whispering about two gangs fighting for the crown. Local papers sensationalized the violence, feeding the tension even more. To young men watching from the sidelines, both crews became symbols of success. Guns replaced ambition. Respect replaced education. The city's youth were being drawn into the same war that had no real winners. By 1994, both gangs had reached their peak. The Johnson crew had money, structure, and strategy. The Burger Bar Boys had numbers, fear, and rage. The streets buzzed with anticipation, as if everyone knew a single spark would ignite a war no one could stop. Derrick Mason stayed calm, but his silence was heavy with warning. Leon Price kept pushing, convinced that only one king could rule Birmingham. The city waited for the first shot, the one that would change everything forever. It was a hot summer night in 1996 when everything finally broke. A nightclub in Lozells, known for its late parties and dangerous crowd, became the center of the storm. Both gangs happened to be there, the Johnson crew celebrating a new business deal, and the Burger Bar Boys out for a night of victory after securing a shipment that had crossed into rival territory. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and beneath the flashing lights, tension simmered like a bomb waiting for a spark. For hours, nothing happened. The two groups stayed on opposite sides of the club, pretending not to notice each other, but everyone could feel the pressure. It was the kind of silence that came before chaos. Outside, the air was thick with humidity and hostility. When the club closed, people poured into the parking lot, laughing, shouting, unaware they were standing on the edge of something historic. A minor argument broke out between two younger members. An insult, a shove, and then a gun was drawn. It happened fast, too fast for anyone to stop. The shot echoed through the night, sending people screaming in every direction. When the smoke cleared, one man lay on the ground, Terry Holt, a trusted member of the Johnson crew, bleeding out before anyone could help him. That single bullet shattered the fragile peace Birmingham had been holding on to for years. The next morning, the city woke to chaos. Word spread faster than the police could control. Within hours, everyone knew that a Johnson crew soldier had been killed, and everyone also knew who was responsible. Derrick Mason didn't say a word publicly, but inside his circle, orders were given. There would be no forgiveness. The Burger Bar boys braced themselves, expecting retaliation, but underestimating how deeply Mason took betrayal. What followed were weeks of silent hits. Houses shot at in the dark, cars torched in driveways, bodies found in canals. No one was safe, not even friends of friends. The Johnson crew moved with precision, striking quietly and disappearing before dawn. The Burger Bar boys fought back with noise and fury, turning neighborhoods into battlegrounds. The once busy streets emptied at night. Shopkeepers closed early. Mothers warned their sons not to stay out. The police increased patrols, but were always one step behind. Every witness stayed silent, either out of fear or loyalty. It wasn't just a gang war anymore. It was a vendetta, fueled by pride and blood. The newspapers called it the Birmingham feud, but on the ground, it was more personal than headlines could capture. Each killing had a name attached, each revenge an emotion. Friends turned enemies, and old alliances crumbled. For Mason and Leon, this wasn't about money anymore. It was about dominance, about proving who truly owned the city. The war that started in a nightclub parking lot would grow into one of the darkest chapters Birmingham had ever seen. And there was no going back. By 1999, Birmingham's nights had become war zones. The air carried a constant tension, and silence meant danger more than safety. Gunshots echoed through alleyways where laughter used to be, and locals learned to recognize the sound of revenge. What began as a single shooting had evolved into an all-out conflict that neither side could control. The Johnson crew and the Burger Bar boys were no longer just names whispered in fear. They were forces that ruled the city's underworld, shaping lives and taking them without hesitation. Derrick Mason watched the world he built begin to collapse under the weight of the bloodshed. His crew was still disciplined, but constant attacks made it hard to stay organized. Every move required caution. Every deal came with risk. The Burger Bar boys had turned the streets into open battlegrounds. Leon Price moved like a storm, unpredictable and destructive. His men drove through rival territories with windows rolled down and guns ready. Drive-bys became so common that no one even flinched at the sound anymore. It was as if the city had grown numb to the violence. One of the most brutal nights came when a convoy of cars belonging to the Johnson crew was ambushed on the M6 motorway. The attack was swift, ruthless, and perfectly timed. Bullets rained across the vehicles, shattering glass and ending 4 lives in seconds. It was a statement from the Burger Bar boys, loud, public, and unforgettable. The police called it a Gangland massacre, the first of its kind in Birmingham. News channels compared it to American gang wars, saying the city had lost its soul to crime. But for those involved, it was just another night of survival. The Johnson crew struck back in their own way. They avoided the spotlight, choosing strategic precision over chaos. Instead of random attacks, they targeted Leon's operations, his dealers, his stash houses, his money flow. One by one, Leon's trusted men disappeared. Some were found days later. Others were never found at all. The balance of power kept shifting, and neither side could claim victory. Every move was answered with something deadlier. The innocent suffered the most. Families were torn apart, businesses closed down, and children grew up surrounded by fear. In some neighborhoods, it became normal to sleep on the floor to avoid stray bullets coming through windows. Police presence increased, but their control was limited. No one wanted to talk. The unspoken rule was simple. Silence kept you alive. As the millennium approached, the violence reached its peak. Mason and Leon had both lost too many men to count, yet neither would stop. Pride had replaced logic, and revenge had become tradition. Each believed the other's destruction would bring peace, but deep down, both knew there was no end to it. Birmingham's underworld was caught in a loop of vengeance that fed on itself, and every drop of blood only strengthened the cycle. What once began as rivalry had turned into an unstoppable storm, and the city could no longer tell who was winning or if anyone ever truly could. The turning point came quietly, not with another burst of gunfire, but with whispers that something big was coming. The police had been watching for years, gathering evidence, tracing money trails, and building a list of names that stretched across the entire city. Both the Johnson crew and the Burger Bar boys had grown careless, blinded by years of dominance and revenge. What they didn't know was that undercover officers had already found their way into the cracks of both organizations. Every phone call, every cash exchange, every quiet meeting in a back room was being recorded. The walls were closing in, and no one saw it coming until it was too late. Leon Price was the first to fall. He had become reckless, trusting too many people and talking too freely. His cousin, desperate for a lighter sentence on unrelated charges, gave the police everything they needed: safe houses, gun locations, drug connections. One morning, before sunrise, the police raided multiple homes across Handsworth and Aston in what they called Operation Curb. Dozens of men were dragged out of bed, including Leon himself. He was found in a penthouse apartment, surrounded by money, weapons, and a few terrified bodyguards. For the first time in years, the man who ruled through fear was silent. Across town, Derrick Mason watched the news unfold from one of his safe houses. He had always believed he was smarter, too cautious to ever be caught. But the same operation soon came for him. Weeks later, as he tried to flee the country, Mason was arrested at Heathrow Airport with a briefcase full of cash, fake IDs, and plane tickets to Spain. The empire he had built with strategy and discipline crumbled in an instant. His arrest marked the end of an era, one where calculated crime still had rules. The aftermath was chaotic. Without their leaders, both gangs fractured into smaller, uncontrollable groups. Younger members, desperate to prove themselves, carried out random attacks that made no sense. The city's violence no longer had a purpose. It was just chaos trying to fill a void. The Johnson crew lost its direction. The Burger Bar boys lost their identity. The same young men who once called themselves soldiers were now targets, hunted by both the law and their own allies. In court, the trials drew massive attention. The evidence was overwhelming: intercepted calls, photographs, confessions. Both Mason and Leon received long sentences, their empires officially dismantled. Yet behind bars, their influence still lingered. Other inmates treated them like legends, and stories about their rise and fall spread like folklore. For Birmingham, the arrests brought a brief sense of relief, but the scars remained. Entire neighborhoods had been shaped by years of fear and violence. Some of the victims' families never found peace, and some of the survivors could never forget. The city tried to rebuild, but the memories of what had happened, the shootings, the betrayals, the blood, became a permanent part of its history. The kings had fallen, but the war they started still echoed through the streets they once ruled. Years later, Birmingham changed its face, but the ghosts of the Johnson crew and the Burger Bar boys never really left. The city built new developments, new parks, and security cameras on every corner, yet the memories of those violent years lingered in the cracks of the pavement. For the people who lived through it, the past was never far away. Every alley had a story. Every silence carried the echo of something that had happened decades before. What once was a war for territory had become a warning for generations that followed. The old men in the neighborhood still spoke of those days in quiet voices, describing how the streets once belonged to young men who believed they were invincible. They remembered the razor gangs before them, the first generation of criminals who fought with blades and fists instead of bullets. Back then, respect was earned through bravery. But when the guns arrived, the code vanished. The streets stopped having rules, and the meaning of power changed forever. From razors to drive-bys, Birmingham had witnessed the full evolution of its underworld. Inside prison walls, both Derrick Mason and Leon Price lived out their sentences as shadows of the men they once were. Mason spent his days in quiet reflection, realizing how his hunger for control had destroyed not just lives, but entire communities. Leon, meanwhile, remained defiant, still trying to control what little influence he had left from behind bars. Their rivalry, once the heartbeat of Birmingham's criminal world, had become nothing more than a distant echo in a place that had moved on without them. Yet even with the leaders gone, their legacy continued to shape the streets. Young boys, drawn to the myths and music inspired by those years, began forming their own crews. They wore the names of the old gangs like badges of honor, unaware of the pain and death those names carried. Some saw it as heritage. Others saw it as destiny. The cycle that had started long before Mason and Lyon was repeating itself in smaller, more fragmented ways. The violence was no longer centralized, but its roots were still alive beneath the surface. Local authorities and community leaders worked hard to change the narrative. Outreach programs, youth centers, and education campaigns tried to pull the next generation away from the streets. For some, it worked. For others, the lure of easy money and street fame was too strong. The line between right and wrong had blurred years ago, and for many, survival still meant making dangerous choices. As time passed, documentaries and books began to revisit those dark years, turning the gang war into part of Birmingham's identity. The city's history became a lesson, a reminder that power built on violence always ends in loss. From the razor gangs of the old days to the drive-by shootings that defined the modern era, Birmingham's streets had seen it all. The names had changed, but the story remained the same. Once the streets taste blood, they never forget.